Hello, dear viewers. We have a lady guest today in the studio. I guess we have had about one lady guest in a year in this program, which is not quite fair, and I hope we have more woman guests in the future. In any event, the guest today is Miss Mary Ann Maskery. Miss Maskery is the president of the Foreign Correspondent Club in Japan. That's the organization of correspondents from overseas. And as a matter of fact, Miss Maskery is the first woman president of that important organization. Miss Maskery, it's nice to have you in this program.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Could you first tell us about this Foreign Correspondent Club of Japan, or FCCJ as it is often called?
The FCCJ has approximately 2,000 members. One-fourth of them are working journalists. The rest are associate members. The purpose of the club is to provide services primarily for the journalists. I said we had 2,000 members. If we had more space, we could have more members because we have a long waiting list. The most important thing we do is to provide professional services.
What do you mean specifically by professional services?
Our primary function is holding news conferences, press luncheons, inviting guest speakers, both people in Japan and perhaps foreign dignitaries or newsmakers who are coming to Japan. We provide a library for people to research their stories. We also provide a space, a desk and a telephone service, a workroom area so that people can actually work in the club. Most press clubs around the world have not been able to keep that up. That's an unusual feature to have what we always insist on saying and repeating, this is a working journalist club. And it makes it more unique than most press clubs around the world.
Are all the members then foreigners?
No, approximately half of the members are Japanese. The journalist members, Japanese members who serve as foreign correspondents overseas, when they return, then they are eligible for membership in the FCCJ if they choose to apply for it.
I know you have a beautiful, rather sizable office space in a very expensive area in Tokyo. Looks like you have rather well-funded.
Well, we've been fortunate in that it is a very convenient area, and that we have right in the center of the city where it is important to have access to government and business leaders. And so we have been lucky to have that space, which has been approximately the same area throughout its history, which is now 40 years old.
So it existed even before the war?
No, this club was formed almost immediately after the war ended. So
that's right.
It's celebrating its 40th anniversary.
4 years since the end of the war. 40 years since the end of the war. What is your primary concern at this point as the president of the FCCJ?
Look, since the most important thing we do is to provide professional services, my constant hope and concern and effort is in thoughts of bringing more people to the club and allowing the foreign reporters to have greater access to the newsmakers of Japan. We are still hoping that Prime Minister Nakasone will accept our invitation to come. We are still hoping in some way that we can learn to deal with the Keisha Club system, which is very, very difficult for foreigners to deal with, because the club system excludes foreigners, and as a result it is very difficult for foreigners to get direct access to information, which is obviously very important when you're covering delicate issues.
You feel somehow you are left out or discriminated against?
Discrimination is a strong word. The system does exclude the foreign correspondents. And so it is a constant effort to try to find a way into the system to get better and more accurate information.
Is there any indication that that will be changed in your favor?
The system is based on traditional methods of communicating within Japan, and those methods change very slowly. I can always hope, and so we keep trying. Whether there's any sign that it will change, I don't know.
Have you had any difficulty in inviting important newsmakers in Japan to speak in your club?
Many people have come to the club over the years, but right now there is a competition between the Foreign Correspondents Club and the Japan Press Club. And usually when a foreign dignitary comes, he's obliged now to go to the Japan Press Club. And although we are sometimes invited, sometimes that access it limits our ability to deal directly with, say, a foreign prime minister or a foreign from whatever country. So there is that competition.
I see. I hope you have more luck in the future as the first woman president. By the way, how do the members like a woman as the president?
I can't answer that question.
You feel any difficulty convincing them or leading them?
I think that since they did elect a woman, that people are willing to accept that. I see no resistance to the idea of a woman as such.
I see. Well, you are also a Tokyo radio correspondent of ABC News, which is one of the three major radio and television networks in the United States, the other two being CBS and NBC. What could you tell us about your background, how you got into this tough field of reporting in the first place?
Where do I start? Well,
when did you make up your mind to become a journalist?
I was interested in journalism. Actually, I didn't develop that to the strong and specific interest until the end of my years in college as an undergraduate student. At that time, I was enrolled in a general liberal arts program.
What did you study? What did you major at that time?
English literature.
English literature.
With philosophy as a minor. You know, these are not things that get you specific jobs. I was also studying education. And so I went out into the world to get myself a job, and at that point, especially then, especially with women, people looked at my record and said, "Why don't you teach English?" Well, that was not my intent. So I went back to school, and I got a degree in journalism.
That's a graduate course?
In a graduate program.
And then what was your first job?
I worked as a writer for UPI, United Press International, in Chicago.
At that time, there were many women working as newspapermen or reporters?
No. At that time, this was the end of '66, beginning of '67. Women were allowed to work as feature writers, usually. It was very
about women's news, cities news.
Something like that. But to get into what we call the city room, to report on the major events and the major news stories. In Chicago at that time, all of the newspaper had a quota system. Only 5 women were allowed into the city room.
Out of how many?
Of anybody who was working. I don't know the total, but I know that in some areas there may have been 40 or 50 people at the newspaper. But only 5 were allowed in the city room.
Now it is the reverse, isn't it? You have some kind of quota by which you have to, they have to employ more than a certain number of women into whatever profession or job they have.
There's a difference between newspapers and television. Television, because it has to get a license from the government, has to respond to certain requirements of equal opportunity.
That's it, equal opportunity.
So they had to prove that they were doing that. And that means not just women, but all minority groups to have access to television. And so it gradually, because of that, has become easier for women to get a job in television. What happened with, in general, the change of events, there were two in particular. The first thing that changed, and this is an important thing to understand because it relates very closely to what's happening in Japan, many people were reluctant to have women work overnight. When I got a job at UPI, I had to work overnight.
Well, as a journalist, you just have to work overnight.
Yes.
If you stick to the office hours, you can't do any good job.
That's right. So that when they started to, well, the man who hired me did not believe in that system, and so he hired women and said, you can work overnight. And that's why I was able to get that job at UPI. So that was one thing that happened. That started to change. Part of it was because of Vietnam, and so many men were going overseas, so that they had to draw on more women. The second thing that happened was the women's movement that started to pick up speed in 1970. In 1970, as I said, there were only a limit of 5 women. And so there was a section, I'm thinking of one newspaper in particular in Chicago. There was a section called Neighborhood News, where they reported on the smaller, less
Somebody
major,
got married, somebody passed away.
little community projects. Within that section, there were many women. They were not allowed to work in the city room, but they were training the men who then went on to work in the city room. And the women accepted that. Starting with the women's lib movement that started, got a lot of attention in 1970, the women started to reject that. And they quit the newspaper. And so many of them quit. The people were saying, what has happened? And they kept saying, there's no opportunity here, so we're leaving. And all of a sudden, they were left without a number of people that they were relying on who had a lot of experience. And it was after that that things started to change.
So you first worked for the news agency. Have you ever worked for a newspaper company?
I have never worked for a newspaper, and I often wonder if I missed something. Because when you look at the old movies, especially the 40s, 30s and 40s, it always seems so dramatic. But I was never part of that. I went from the wire service to radio, then to television, and since I've been in Japan, I've been doing primarily radio. No newspapers.
So how many years now you have been working in this country?
In this country for almost 7 years.
How do you like it as a person living here and also as a reporter?
Well, I've come to think of this as home right now. I can't imagine. I know when the time comes to leave, it's going to be difficult. As a reporter, I've learned to slowly understand the system and to learn to work with it. You have to know when something is said, what people really mean. And you do a lot of reading between the lines, perhaps more so than you would, say, back in the States, to get the real meaning of what is happening.
Well, I think Japan is a pleasant enough country to live, but I'm not quite sure whether it is really a good country from the viewpoint of a reporter.
Well, it does present problems, trying to get at information, trying to have access to information.
First, of course, you have a problem of language.
That is a problem, but it's not necessarily the major problem. Certainly in doing television, language is a problem, but it's a problem because the American system of television reporting is different. And there is a reluctance to use dubbing or direct translation. It's just not part of the customary method of broadcasting in the States.
So all the Japanese, when they appear on the American television, have to speak in English?
Either speak in English, or if a person is speaking in Japanese, then the reporter summarizes It's not a direct translation. It's a summary. And so when you have to rely on either translation or a summary, a lot of the feeling is lost. So it's
Well,
often
you are
hard.
rather chauvinistic or ethnocentric when it comes to language. We are more flexible.
I think Japan is the Japanese people assume a necessity for translation and have learned over the years to deal with it and to accept it. With an American audience,
It's still difficult.
it's still difficult.
Do you think it will change in due course?
In accepting translation?
Yeah. Or become more acceptable to foreign language or translation or interpretation or superimpose on the TV network?
Superimpose is accepted better than dubbing or translation. For example, like here, when the major movies in the States or any other country comes here, when it's shown first, it's shown with the subtitles. That is more acceptable to an American audience usually than the dubbing system. There is very little effort to dub most material in the United States.
But if you insist on Japanese speaking in English, you can't quite get the real picture of Japan, because most Japanese, particularly well-informed Japanese, naturally feel much more comfortable speaking in Japanese.
Of course.
How do you
So it's a
overcome
problem.
this?
The only way to do that is to gather the information that somebody would give you speaking in Japanese, and then to tell the audience that as a reporter. There's a heavier reliance on the reporter telling the story then, rather than directly the particular Japanese individuals telling his own story.
Now, how do you pick the subject? I feel that what we see and hear from the United States is much greater in quantity than you report from here and what American people see of Japan. So I think it is rather important that what particular subject that you really choose to report to the American audience.
The story has to be something that will have interest there. So there has to be some kind of connection. Over the years, it has been easier to report from Europe, for example, because Americans always assume a connection with Europe. Explaining Japan has always been a different matter because there is a greater distance between the two peoples.
But
recently that has changed.
What they may be interested in may be different from what is really important here.
Well, the most important things in terms of what is reported right now is almost always trade stories. Trade and economics.
That's true nowadays.
Yes. Because it's the trade and economic issues in Japan that directly affect the United States right now. There are many issues that are interesting, but unless you want the audience to take a look and to care, so you have to have some kind of connection.
Well, I sometimes sense some gap in perception about, for example, for this trade matter. Americans tend to feel that there is greater inequality or discrimination in the area of trade than we feel there is in this country. I may feel that your reporting and the resulting perception may have something to do with it. How would you say?
I think that we're talking about a problem that affects two different people in two absolutely different ways. So that there is bound to be two views, whether it's not even a matter of reporting it or not reporting it. It's a question of when an American negotiator sits down with a Japanese negotiator, they are coming from two different perspectives. And one of the difficulty and almost the agony of these negotiations comes from the fact that both people have different interests involved. In terms of reporting it, I can only talk about the automobile issue because that's been such a long, ongoing issue, and I think I've done more stories on automobiles than anything else in 7 years.
That's visible
It's very
to
visible,
the American audience.
immediately understandable. Explaining, for example, the latest issue of telecommunications is far more complicated because people don't necessarily relate to it immediately, but automobiles people understand.
That's right.
And when
And they feel that their job is somewhat related to that too.
yes. So that was a very public and obvious and at times emotional story. When it first started to develop as a major issue, the Japanese companies were very hesitant and very reluctant and very worried about criticism. And it was often difficult to, you know, if you called up and you said you wanted to interview somebody or if you wanted to see if you could film in a factory. It was very long and involved because I think they assumed automatically that any report would be critical. I hope that over the years they have learned that that's not true necessarily.
Well, if, for example, the American public know about how Japanese workers, for example, work in the plant, how their life depend upon automobile industries and so on, then I think that the public would have better understanding of the picture in spite of the big trade gap.
The automobile issue was as emotional as it was because the number of American workers suddenly put out of work. And the size of that represented something that was very, very sensitive. And that is why that issue was such a big issue for so many years, and remains and will remain. It's hard to explain beyond that. People were interested in how things were done here. One of the things, you know, I've had a number of people say to me, oh, because I'm Japanese, if I go to Detroit, it would be very dangerous for me because people will hate me. Actually, what I find interesting is that the Detroit newspapers print a great many stories about Japan, far more than you will find in most cities in the United States. Because people have become aware of Japan as a result of the automobile issue, they're interested in everything. All stories about traveling in Japan, stories about various cultural issues that you will not find other cities that interested in them. So although the automobile issue caused a lot of emotional upheaval in some respects, it also made Americans generally, and Detroit people in particular, much more aware of Japan.
Not necessarily in a negative sense.
Right. It was that they were aware, they wanted to hear about how things were done in Japan. They wanted to know more about the people and why the companies here could be so successful. So in a sense, although you may think of the issue as a negative one, from my own perspective in trying to report on Japan, I think the result in the growing interest and awareness is a very positive one.
I see. So those people in Detroit hate Japanese automobiles, but they don't necessarily hate Japanese people.
Right.
I see.
And some of them even buy Japanese automobiles.
Now, what are other subjects that you recently reported to the United States?
One recent one I can bring up is doing a report on how drunk drivers are handled here in Japan.
Drunken drivers.
Yes.
Why was that interesting to you?
Because that has become a big issue in the States, and there have been many efforts in cities and towns to do something to get tougher, to restrict what they call the happy hour, which were bars in order to entice people to come and stop by after work and have a drink. They offered cheaper drinks. That put more drunks on the road.
So that was
at nighttime.
A rather imminent social problem in the United States.
It's a problem that's been around for a long time, but because of the efforts of local communities to stop it or put some kind of controls on it, it became a more public interest. And so it was interesting to show how the efforts made here to control it's the same problem here, but the controls and the method of dealing with it are different.
I see.
Generally speaking, much more strict.
So how was your reporting on Japanese drunken drivers accepted by the Americans?
I never know how anything is accepted. Whenever I put anything on the air, I always assume that it will put perhaps one thought in one person's mind, and maybe people might think about it.
I see. Well, that was very interesting. You are doing a great job, and I hope you will continue to reporting on Japan for the Americans.
Thank you
Thank you very
much.
much, Ms. Maskery. Enjoyed it very much.